You could call it political correctness, but at least this tremendous pressure to be sensitive to people's different kinds of vulnerabilities. It also means that uh, humor gets in a certain way sanitized. But in the India I grew up in, humor was not sanitized. But humor, as Bakhtin and others have shown, humor allows you to create breathing spaces.
We thought that someone like you who is far more familiar, intellectually engaged with the idea of Adda at very early stage in your intellectual journey, I'm sure you would have received a lot as a growing up or as a student, as a youth, through those socio-cultural formations where ideas were exchanged, and not exchanged always and only in harmonious fashion. I'm sure it was also exchanged with lots of contestation. In that light, we thought we should request you to give us a glimpse of your personal journey. I mean, the milestones of scholarship comes little later, but they are not disconnected from the personal journey one goes through.
Since we're talking about Adda was central to my growing up in Calcutta.
Yeah, exactly.
Because even before you knew it, if cousins were visiting, and most of my extended family, we were basically from East Bengal, from what became East Pakistan. But the family moved to Calcutta, and my father ensured that many of my uncles lived close by. So there was a sense of an extended family. So
Right.
even if cousins dropped in, basically we had Adda, which included singing, which included cracking jokes. And as you know, Indians love telling jokes. This idea that you actually enjoy human company of your own age, slightly older people, slightly younger people, and teasing, joking were always part of that. So like I had a cousin. As in India, we say cousin sister, who was older to me. And I used to tease her, and I told her one day, must have been in high school, and her name was Maya. And we say Maya the older sister figure. So I said to Maya di, I've found a suitable groom for you. And it's a very good job. Company gives him car, everything. So basically, Maya di, I said he comes in the neighborhood, I'll show him to you. It's really very good. And basically, those days the corporation used to give a bullock cart for collection of garbage. And so when the man came in, and in a middle class family, this groom with a car was a big deal, right? Because we didn't have cars, so I was a family car. So now today, to tell this joke, I can't afford to be forgetful of the fact that the guy on the bullock cart was probably an ex-untouchable guy who was from Bihar. They used to come and work for the corporation. But in those days, when I cracked the joke, of course, I was not aware of my own prejudices. So it was a joke in that kind of setting. But all that was part of growing up, right? All that was kind of mimicking somebody or joking with somebody. And some of that sometimes was hurtful. As you said, like when you see in Indian relationships, this is changing now, and I've lived in the West, and in the West, because of tremendous pressure of you could call it political correctness, but at least this tremendous pressure to be sensitive to people's different kinds of vulnerabilities. It also means that humor gets in a certain way sanitized.
Yes.
But in the India I grew up in, humor was not sanitized. And humor was often hurtful. Now when I look back, and a lot of prejudice. At school, I went to a Bengali dominant school, and I remember how much I saw. Now I think when all of these children from Tamil families or Hindi speaking families who were with us, because the medium of instruction was textbooks were in English, so we had Bengalis have this category: Bengalis and non-Bengali. Right? The world is divided into two camps: Bengalis and non-Bengalis. I don't think any other Indian Indian groups have these categories, like Marathi and non-Marathi. But we had this. So
Right.
so-called non-Bengali students. I mean, now I look back and I think we used to make life hell for them sometimes with our humor. Like if somebody had a very broad Tamil accent, and in India we all bring our regional vernacular accents to bear on the English we speak. You can always tell how um, a Malayalam speaking person would speak English, and how that might be different from a Bengali speaking person speaking English, or a Tamil speaking. And my friend Sanjay Subramaniam, the historian, is very good at doing a production of producing these different voices. Sanjay is very good showing this is how a Mallu would speak English, this is how a Tamilian would speak English, this is how a Bong would speak English. But so humor was not sanitized. And humor was hurtful for people at whose expense you cracked the joke. But
Right.
at the same time, people all grew up. I wouldn't say with an evenly distributed capacity to deal with such humors, but the fact is you had to deal with such humors. Because my eyes were bad from early on, so I had glasses when most kids in the school. So I was called a char choko, right? So the boy with 4 eyes, and people wouldn't
Right.
call me by my name. They say, "Hey, char choko." So, so every disability
Hmm.
became part of somebody else's sense of humor. But you also learn to live with it, because that's how society was made. You couldn't just jump out of it. Um, and Indian society was like that. So when I was growing up, the smallpox wasn't yet eradicated, so we had to get vaccinations for smallpox. And you had people all around you with pockmarked faces, people who had survived pox. And and you realize how old these prejudices are. That once I was in the University of Minnesota, and they have some good collections of letters from some of the Peshwas in English translation, 18th century letters. A very good collection. And I was reading one of the letters. I forget which Peshwa, probably it was Bajirao II, perhaps, but who was sending somebody to find a bride for his son. And there were 2 instructions given. So just go around in the Peshwa territory, look for a girl, good-looking girl. And one instruction was that if their family objects, then bring the family also. Not just the girl. If the family objects, pick them up and bring all of them to Pune. But the second criterion was she must not have a pockmarked face.
Hmm.
So it was obviously, you realize that it was so common for both men and women to have their faces disfigured by pox, right? And now I realize that a lot of that was around us, and we made jokes of those things. Even though by the time I was growing up, our textbooks, actually, Bangla textbooks always said, don't call a person with a limp, the person with a limp, or Langra was the Bengali name, was if
Yes.
somebody had
Hmm.
So, kana ke kana bolibe na. If somebody is blind in one eye, don't call them kana, which is the word for a man. But where in India I find the cruel jokes still survive, very cruel jokes, is in the political sphere. If you're a politician, then you
Right.
can be called you can be called a pappu, you can be called all kinds of things, chappaninch, or anything can be said about
Yes.
you.
Yeah.
Huh?
Hmm.
You can recently I heard somebody has claimed that Mamata Banerjee's brother's son, right?
Yes.
Is actually her son. Like but so in India, I find that in today's India, where this culture of cruelty through humor remains very
Hmm.
powerfully, and I'm sure it's there in society as well, but at least
True.
in the educated circle, somebody would say, don't do that.
Hmm.
So I'm just going back to what you said before, Dev, that there's a lot one learned in Adda. There was Adda at home, Adda outside, but Adda's always contained this biting sense of humor. And I'll tell you, I won't name people because they're all names you know. They're all well-known people today. So once
Yeah.
I was in an adda, a few years ago, I was in an adda in Kolkata with academic friends, friends from subaltern studies, friends from around subaltern studies, well-known writers, etc., etc. So this was an adda in a restaurant, and I had to go. So somebody said, "Why are you leaving early?" So I said, "If I don't leave early, when will you get an opportunity to backbite?" So unless I present my back to you, when will you speak ill of me? I'm just sitting here. You can't speak ill of me. So,
True, logically.
but so there was this because when I transitioned from India to Australia, and in Australia there was already a kind of, not in a kind of fearsome PC way, but there was already a lot of sensitization of people to these sorts of things. And so in the classroom or even in conversations, Australians had to get to know you fairly well to be nasty about somebody, Whereas I grew up in India where the freedom to be nasty was like enshrined in the constitution. It was like one of the fundamental rights you grew up with, even if you dread anything about what your rights were. So learning was a painful process. You learned a lot, but being humiliated was part of learning, and that was part of pedagogy once upon a time. So when I was in school, of course, one of the things the teachers did was to humiliate you. And even in high school, right, when I was a student of science, and used to go to this Bangla medium school, Mitra Institution, good school, but the physics teacher, my original name given to me by my family was Dipesh Chandra, because Chandra runs in the family, but I dropped Chandra. So, and this teacher somehow liked the sound of Dipesh Chandra or whatever. So he would come to physics class, morning class, first period, and he would ask me the same question every class. It just said, he would rub his nose and say, Dipesh Chandra, so I'd stand up. What is the definition of specific gravity? So I'd give him a definition, mixing English words with Bengali words. He said, either say it in Bangla or say it in English. So okay, I would repeat it in English. And then he would say, Hoini, wrong. Stand up on the bench. So I'd stand up on the bench. And then he would turn to another young boy called Debashish Ganguly. And he said, Debashish Ganguly, you also stand up on the bench. No questions for Debashish. So I was at least given a question which I ostensibly failed to answer. So teacher said, stand up on the bench. And with Debashish, you also stand up on the bench. And after 10, 15 minutes, he'll say, okay, now you can sit down now. And one day I said to him, I said, sir, in class, I said, sir, will you tell me the correct definition of specific gravity? Which is the same question I asked him. He said, if I told you the correct definition, how would I be able to make you stand up on the bench? So just there's this sadistic pleasure of coming into the classroom, completely arbitrarily getting the same guy to stand up on the bench every day for 10 minutes. Somehow appealed to, it was part of how you learn. And he wasted 10 minutes doing this. Then he started to teach. So in that sense, learning was the kind of the accepted notions of teaching somebody included humiliation, which is why, there was a certain kind of elitism in it, or there was a certain kind of barriers to education. If somebody already came into the classroom with a sense of having been humiliated by society, then it was hard for them to enter that, But if you were from a Brahmin family, then in a Brahmin family you had heard stories like this. I mean, you grew up hearing stories about your parents' teachers, and they're all stories about being subjected to insults and humiliation as part of learning something. But as a society, the society I grew up in India, it was not the kind of university environment in which I work today, or even in the one I found in Australia, where people are much more sensitized and people tread carefully. Today a class student in my class can tell me, in America they have the right to tell me that if you use this word, it triggers something in me. So actually, teachers are meant to give trigger warnings. I mean, if this hasn't come to India, it will, because we copy everything that happens
Right.
in America. So I'm sure it will come.
Mm.
So before you say something, if you think, oh, this might make somebody feel bad or whatever, you say, look, I'm going to say something that may trigger something. So now, I didn't grow up in an India where this was done. People didn't care if something triggered something. And therefore, you had to learn to kind of brush off the insults,
True.
forget the injuries that hurt you, and then go back, let the wounds heal and go back. And some days you wounded others, knowingly, unknowingly.
Yeah.
That was the nature of the game.
So I hope this all must have changed once you joined the professional group of historians, particularly
No, that's what I'm saying. No, it didn't. I mean, not at all. So in Calcutta, in the center where Partho worked, and he's now retired, but he still is honorary professor there. And when I joined the center, I was a young student, even academically younger than Dibyendu, because I'd come into history to do PhD, but I didn't know any history, so I was kind of a combination of a first-year undergraduate student and a PhD student. So kind of, I was going to the archive, but also reading and thinking and learning to speak like a social scientist. And in those days, at the center, people used to give seminars.
Mm.
And if somebody didn't seem very intelligent in what they presented, and the seminar room was on the third floor, when in Indian terms, second floor, but in American terms, third floor. And because we wanted seminars and things to be Congress style or Indian style, so basically there was a sheet spread on the floor, and you had to sit down on the floor, and kind of with cross-legged, right? And when Western people had a lot of trouble because they're not used to sitting down in that, and people used to derive some joy from just watching them having difficulty sitting down or staying sort of in that position for an hour or hour and a half while the discussion was going on. So there was partly this kind of nationalist desire to hurt Westerners when they come into the seminars. But I still remember, if somebody gave a bad seminar, or you felt that it was not a very bright presentation, people would come down the stairs saying, "Lokta khub bhalo," very good man. Very good man was not a compliment. So no, informally, one lived and breathed this culture, and so I've written recently saying that when I went to Australia and found a different way of being the first time in Australia, I remember I met a person who's become a very good friend of mine, Roger Stewart, and he seemed very bright, extremely bright, and extremely kind. And for us, this was a contradiction in terms. So I still remember writing back to Kolkata to a friend, probably Gautam, saying, this very bright man is also very kind. Like, how can that be? So this expression, somebody is very kind or somebody is very good, meant they're not very bright. So because it was inconceivable that a bright man would not be cruel.
Right.
Cruel with his words, cruel with his criticism, that his criticism would be biting. And if somebody made biting criticism of somebody else, particularly in print, it was a story that people proudly told one another. Because I grew up learning this by heart, because then I would also tell this story, Radha does, right? So Ranjit Guha, the subaltern studies guru, and I can tell you this story, but this is in print.
Okay.
So there was a man. There's a man called Shomen Mukherjee, now still alive, an older historian of Calcutta, very good historian, who used to be a fellow in Oxford, in St. Antony's College. So he edited one particular issue of these annual volumes or if they're annual papers that used to come out of St. Antony's, called St. Antony's Papers. And Tapan Rai Chaudhary was at St. Antony's College. So there was South Asia thing there. Now Faisal Devji is there. So anyway, so he produced this one edition of St. Anthony's Papers, and Ranjit Da wrote a review of it. And the review began by saying, academics have an albatross slung across their necks. You cannot do anything about it because it goes with the job, and it comes in the form of weekly seminars that we should rush into print all our weekly burps. And then the next line said, alas, Dr. Mukherjee has fallen for the temptation. So Shoman Mukherjee always told me that this cost him his job, this review. His fellowship was not renewed. But I don't know if there's but you know, when you think about it, when you write such reviews, I mean, at the end of the day, somebody else who produced a book, who put a collection of essays together, I mean, they did some work, even putting a collection of essays together, copy editing, proofreading. There's some labor there.
Yes.
And to completely dismiss it in this kind of way could not have been an enjoyable experience for Dr. Mukherjee, right?
Sure.
But we all enjoyed and laughed at the skill that Ranjit Da showed in kind of in wounding somebody, right? With his humor, with his control of English, all of those things. So when I went to Australia, I realized that argumentation that I grew up on, this traditional argumentation, was almost like a practice of Kshatriya behavior. I mean, even though I was born in a Brahmin family, but it was like I had to kill your argument. You know, at least I had to kind of destroy your argument. The good thing about it was that in order to survive in that system, you had to learn to swim in those waters. In other words, you had to learn to produce counter argument, hit other people with your arguments.
Yes.
But it also meant it left a lot of people wounded. And in the end, you sometimes destroyed friendships. But one lived in that culture. So to give you another example where I was to blame. And I was a young person. I was teaching in Melbourne then, but subaltern studies had just started to come out. And I was invited for dinner to a very well-known economic historian in Calcutta of that zamana, who was a very well-known Marxist economic historian, lefty historian, if not Marxist. And he, before dinner was served, and some drinks had been served, so I was also probably a little bit high on the drinks. So this gentleman, who was like a teacher, I mean, and we learned a lot from his work. And he was very dismissive of subaltern studies, but mainly dismissive of Ranjit Da, elementary aspects. So he says to me, with waving his hand like this, I have read elementary aspects, and I learned nothing from it. So I mean, elementary aspects for me has been a very formative and important book. So I said to him, and mind you, he's my teacher's age. I'm just a fresh PhD out, coming teaching him. So I said to him, look, so and so da, Bengali, everybody is da, older person, and so da.
Right.
I hear you. So that you did not learn anything from elementary aspects is a fact, because you tell me that you haven't learned anything. But what is the significance of this statement? Why is your not learning anything from elementary aspect a significant statement? Are you capable of learning from everything? and that destroyed a friendship for probably 30 years. I'm even told that a certain prize was denied me because somebody related to him was on the committee.
Okay.
And so, but if you grow up in that society, you learn to speak like this. And sometimes the result is, but if you've spoken like this to somebody higher up, like somebody older, more established, then that person didn't forgive you. So you have to kind of follow the rules of hierarchy, So you had to learn. So there's the unfairness in the system was that you could really dismiss people lower in the hierarchical scale than, or you could dismiss a peer, but you could not dismiss a senior person, because then you got penalized in other ways. So the social, so this mode of speaking did not challenge the social hierarchy. But on the other hand, it kind of, it's like, in Mughal India, if you were just a poet in the court of Akbar or somebody, your promotions came slowly, because you had to learn to kill somebody. You had to learn to wield the sword for the emperor, because then you'd be given a jagirdar. A poet's jaigir was a much smaller jaigir than. So similarly, so just as in Mughal India, if you're an aspiring, ambitious person in Mughal India, you had to take the risk of getting killed or killing somebody.
Right.
You had to learn that skill. Similarly, in the intellectual atmosphere that I grew up in, you had to sort of be able to take this and give this. And it actually meant that there was a gendered aspect to it. So most women didn't come into it, and those who came in,
Right.
They were very good. They became very good. So, like, if I think of Dharma Kumar, who set up the Indian Economic and Socialist Review, this very feisty Tamil woman, she could give it back to you as well. She got it, and Gayatri Spivak.
Yes.
Some of this, so and I think for women it was a harder struggle, because women are not usually brought up to speak harshly. At the end of the day, it meant that you had to divest your ego from the argument you were making, and you had to accept that the better argument should win the day. I mean, this is how I became a Marxist in those days, because I used to lose all my arguments to an older cousin who was a Marxist. And I finally thought, why the hell should I be on losing side? I should be arguing like him. Then I'll win the arguments. So there was Adda, and Adda had all these characteristics.
And I observed that you also talked about, like, humor does not really change the social hierarchy. One thing that we can see is there are different genres of humor that were existing and that are existing in India as well.
Right.
So even if we talk about Bengal, there is Kali Ghat paintings. If you know about that. Kali Ghat paintings. In that paintings, we actually trace a history of Indian versions of caricatures or Indian versions of cartoons, through which it actually satirizes gendered relations in the society. So it's not really like it does not change or resist the social hierarchy. It also tries to resist the social hierarchy through different kinds of spheres. But looking at the contemporary scenario, humor has become a very serious job. Because the moment you speak truth to power, you may be harassed or you may be incarcerated in jail. That shift has taken place somehow. Even a sense of humor is somehow declining. So how do you see that?
But humor, as Bakhtin and others have shown, humor allows you to create breathing spaces.
Yeah.
In a situation which otherwise chokes you to death. So in that sense, of course, and that way, humor has an old tradition. So even for Brahmins, there's this notion of apad dharma. So that which becomes your dharma when you are in danger.
Yeah.
And that includes having khana with a Yavanik person, with a Musliman or Sahib or whatever, where you can actually break your rules in order to survive.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of Brahminical humor about that, kind of self-deprecating humor. In this situation, what do I do? Kind of humor. So I totally agree with you that, without humor, how can you live? What has happened in contemporary India is that because comedians are being attacked, so humor is humor as commodified entertainment. The humor that you go to enjoy by paying money in a public domain, like
Yeah.
in a comedy show or in a restaurant, that is being driven underground.
True.
In the sense it's being made private. So it doesn't mean that the jokes will not be made. The jokes will be made. The only people, that's why I feel the only people who seem to be protected from this are people who are directly in political power.
Yeah.
So X in political power can totally insult Y in political power, but none of them will be actually punished. But if
Yeah.
you're not in political power and you don't have political, you're not backed up by politicians or powerful people, then you are much more vulnerable. And I think, but this happened in many authoritarian societies. When we were growing up, the Soviet Union was full of this kind of humor,
Yeah.
right? And one of the practical humors that Soviet journalists used to play in Brezhnev's time is that they used to publish, from time to time, they would publish an obituary of Brezhnev while he was alive. And then next day apologize and say, oh, this was based on false information.
Right.
But they were basically trying to say, we wish he was dead by publishing obituaries before he was dead. So I think humor is a very potent instrument for human beings to make life livable, to deal with contradictions, to deal with all the ambiguities. So I think that's why in America now the classroom is almost being made humorless because of a huge sanitization. When you're a child and you come into language, you imbibe prejudice. That's what grown-ups give to you. We don't like such and such things. Their food is horrible. This is smelly. They don't shower enough. All these kind of things that go on in a neighborhood, right? And people with whom you're sharing when it's salt and haldi when you're short of them. But you joke about the same people. Their cooking is so smelly. Or if you're a vegetarian, so they're cooking meat upstairs and this smell is coming in. It's a real dilemma, because I think really policing every kind of humor, because humor can hurt, will really produce a society that is not prepared to take any risk at all in human relationships. But I feel that no human relationship can be deepened without taking risks.
True.
And if you say, I will first create trust and then take risk, it's a good thing to do. First create trust and then take risk. But you can't always do that.
Have seen, this pandemic has changed many things. One thing also that we have seen, that historians have now started writing about diseases, pandemic, histories of pandemic, also comparing different kinds of histories, Indian and British kind of pandemic histories. So in this context, what do you think that historians, or particularly historians in South Asia, should learn about history writing or about doing history? Yeah.
So the pandemic, first of all, teaches us about digital divide, the inequality in human societies. So they invented this, the West invented this expression, social distance. And it really means, what it means is, first, creating mentally a separation between the conception of society and the conception of the individual body. So, and the idea was that if you could reconstitute society while separating individual bodies, you don't have to create social distance. So we have now met and we have recreated some social relationship here, but through a medium which allows us to separate our bodies. So even though I can see you, so only a part of my perceptual apparatus is at work in perceiving you. I can't shake hands with you. So I have no sense of any tactile sense of how you feel to touch, right? I can see you, I can hear you, but I can't touch you. But who can do this? It can only be done by people who somehow can pay directly or indirectly for the electronic platforms on which they reconstitute society. So this society that we've created, it's actually allowing somebody to make money. See, normally the society you're born in, nobody makes money out of it. People make money out of social relationships later on. But we are born outside of monetary relations in being social. Here, you realize that once through the pandemic, capitalism will allow those who can pay to be social to be social. So this is a kind of capitalist reconstitution of society. And therefore, those who can't pay will not have this social. What they will have is the old social in which they would be vulnerable to the pandemic. Because they will be 5 people sleeping in a room, 6 people sleeping in a room, the migrant laborers, they would be so the first thing it teaches is how important inequality is, how important capitalism is, and how basically the pandemic again brings forward human inequalities and tells us that inequality itself leaves human beings vulnerable. Because people who can't reconstitute this society cannot do so because they actually are left in the old social, which we're trying to escape. So they remain the entry points for the virus into our society. Tagore has a beautiful line in a poem where he says, "Jare tumi phelo piche, she tomare taniche poschate." And the line is, the person whom you place behind you is actually the person who drags you back. So it is in your. So first of all, there's that. Secondly, the pandemic clearly showed that if humans withdraw and are forced to withdraw from some of their activities, the sky becomes bluer, the air is cleaner, the rivers carry water that seems more transparent and cleaner. Birds come back that you haven't seen in the cities. Animals come back. They may not be welcome, but some of them come back. Some of them are welcome. So it makes obvious what human beings do to the planet. And the pandemic has also, if you think about it, it has told us other stories. The relationship between humans and the non-human world. In the last 20 years, 75% of infectious diseases has come to humans from wild animals.
Yeah.
And that's why they're called zoonotic diseases. And why do they come from wild animals? Because wild animals normally don't seek out humans. They don't like humans very much. I mean, there's no reason to like humans very much. I think if the polar bear's view of humans wouldn't be a complimentary one, one can say that, right? They come close to us because we destroy their habitat. So we force them to come close to us. And we destroy their habitat by destroying jungles. And we destroy jungles mainly to create farmland, also to mine. I mean, in India, the most of the mining areas are the jungle areas, are the tribal areas. They all kind of, overlap. So it's extractive capitalism is expanding farmland. That's all destroying the jungles. And the more you destroy the jungles, the more you force animals to come out of their habitat. And that's been happening in India for a while now, So the monkey menace in Delhi is a fascinating case, where these rhesus monkeys came to Delhi because they were losing habitat and their numbers were actually falling. But now they have learned to live so well in Delhi's environment that the numbers have grown. And there are certain parts of Delhi which are controlled by monkeys. So if I visit Delhi, friends would say, don't go for a morning walk there. It's just too many monkeys there. So they've become so good at being urban wild animals that they've now claimed certain parts of the city for themselves. And they basically tell humans, don't come here.
Urban wild animal is very suggestive.
Yeah, the urban. No, if you go on YouTube, Mumbai is expanding. And Mumbai is expanding into leopard territories. And you will find a very, very interesting leopard story is fascinating. There's a very interesting YouTube video where you will see that a leopard is looking at this high-rise building through a glass door that opens automatically. And the leopard is looking through the glass door because there's a domestic dog. and leopards hate pariah street dogs. Because the street dogs work in gangs and they begin to bark together when the moment a leopard comes.
Right.
So the leopard can't fight with them because they all try to then. And the leopard hate it that they announce the leopard's arrival. So the leopard have found out that domestic dogs are single dogs. And they're not part of a gang. So the leopards are having been thrown out of their habitat. They're trying to come into cities and trying to learn what is the most suitable food in the city. And one of the decisions they seem to have made is that the domestic dog is a kind of animal. It's nicely fed. It's not skinny like a street dog. Not skin and bones. There's flesh, fat, and it's a nice one to have one.
Yeah,
so
prized leopards, I must say.
Yeah, exactly. And then you look at this story again from Maharashtra. I think remember this tigress that was killed called Avni, and the 3 cubs were killed. And the reason why they were killed by humans, and it's illegal to kill tigers, but the newspaper story says the reason they were killed was because Avni was not only killing humans, she was teaching her cubs to kill humans. And why was she teaching cubs to kill humans? Because humans had gone into her area in search of wood, livelihood. And Avni had found out that humans are easy to kill. And because she was hunting with her cubs, and cubs learn by seeing the mother hunt. So they were naturally learning to identify humans as potential food. Whereas tigers normally avoid humans. So basically our expansion, the expansion of human existence, human society, for all kinds of reasons, is destroying wildlife, pushing wild creatures to come closer to us. Basically humans have changed, we're changing the order of life without realizing that we are a minority form of life. And virus and bacteria, these microbial forms of life, are the majority forms of life, both by weight and by numbers.
True.
Pandemic teaches us this relationship between humans, non-humans. So there are many lessons to be drawn from the pandemic. But the other lessons we learn also, these are good things, which is that we don't always have to travel for academic conferences or business meetings. And less air travel is not a bad thing for the world. I don't know which of these lessons we will actually learn. But if you think through the pandemic has many lessons for us. Now, you were actually talking about what historians are doing. So historians are trying to understand pandemics, sometimes writing histories of how societies have reacted to pandemics before.
Yeah, true.
So it's also what it's done is it made pandemic into a more illnesses into a more popular subject of history. But if we do it well, then we'll also see that it involves writing histories of humans and non-humans together. So if it's done well, it will remind us of our relationship to the non-human.
Sir, you have recent interventions in climate change. So could you please reflect more on this with particular reference to how you engage with the debates on global justice and global south and the climate change?
Climate change has many different aspects of justice. So one justice question is really about who are historically responsible, and clearly it's the developed nations that are emitted more of greenhouse gases, and therefore they're responsible. And then, so there are 2 kinds of responsibility people talk about. One is they say, or guilt. Which are the nations that are retrospectively guilty? And clearly it's the Western nations. And which are the nations that are prospectively guilty, who will have to produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in order to pull people out of poverty? And that's India and China. So, so there's a kind of retrospective guilt and there's a prospective guilt. And the other question that comes up also is that, yes, even if the Western nations are guilty, do you make a distinction between your guilt or your responsibility for an unintended consequence of your action that you were not aware of.
Yeah.
And that sense of responsibility and the sense of responsibility you have when you have become aware of, but you're still doing the bad thing. So that's an unresolved question. Because the guilt argument ran in two different ways. One was that, so from it came the argument that Western nations should therefore pass on to poorer countries climate-friendly technologies for free or for a very low cost price.
Yeah.
The climate justice arguments have not been attended to, because what happened was the justice argument came up, and Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal from Center for Science and Environment were actually very critical in that first intervention they made in 1991 when they produced a booklet called Global Warming in an Unequal World, the case of environmental colonialism. And I think they made people more aware of that kind of injustice of the situation. But the justice argument eventually kind of lost its place because the deterioration of the climate situation was going on so fast, and China had become the biggest emitter. So
Yeah.
the India-China axis kind of broke because China became the world manufacturer. So basically, people were passing on to China their emissions. So I could be a German guy wearing a nice piece of cloth, so shirt made in Dhaka or in Beijing, right? And the Chinese were theoretically responsible for the production of greenhouse gas while it was being produced because I was consuming this. So, but that kind of broke the China-India axis that was there initially. So if you actually look at the Paris climate deal, the way countries managed the guilt question was by saying there'll be no formal, no imposed responsibility. Countries will set their own national targets for reduction of greenhouse gases, and India's actually energy intensity per unit of GDP has gone down. Not emissions, but energy intensity has gone down, which is true. So the justice argument has, in some ways, that justice argument, which was about nations, developed nations, that's kind of been, I would say, superseded by events. It has not been answered, but people have moved on from it because they had to do something. The other kind of justice argument, which is not to do with nations, but with capitalism. The problem is, you can say capitalism is responsible, but who do you take to court? See, if you say nations have legal personalities, and you can take rich nations to the International Court of Justice and say, okay,
Right.
But if you say capitalism, then the only answer is revolution, getting rid of capitalism. And as somebody said, if you think, because some people argue that we must first get rid of capitalism, then deal with climate. That's the root cause. And then somebody quipped, an American scientist, saying, if you think that you have to first get rid of capitalism and then solve the climate problem, then clearly the climate problem is not urgent enough for you. I mean, capitalism is clearly a more urgent problem. So their argument was that you have to work through capitalism. You have to assume that capitalism exists. You have to work through capitalism. Therefore, this whole question of green technology, carbon tax, trade and cap emissions, all of the creating marketplace in emission rights and all of those things, which are things that you can do through capitalism. So kind of create a market, provide better market signals for transition to green technology. The whole question of financing green technology through the states. All of these things are important. And part of the problem is, of course, that you see when you have the same people who were in the fossil fuel market, who define themselves broadly as the energy market, and as a good rational business deal, then they say, now we will move into renewables. Then what happens is that the fossil fuel guys in effect control the rate of change because they decide how fast or how slow they can move into renewables. So which means they have plans about amortization of the fossil fuel assets. Right? So they have say, okay, I've invested so many crores in fossil fuel. So I'm not going to move
Right.
into renewables until I can amortize this, which means I may not make as much money out of it as I used to think, but let me make as much money out of it as I can. So these become political economic games. So you'll go to the government and say, look, coal is still cheaper, all kinds of arguments come into play there. And the justice argument also is harder to stand upon unless you make a global position, which is the global north and global south. Because if you talk about global north and global south, then these are two structures that run through every country.
Right.
Right? In India, you have a part of the global north, though the bulk of the people are in global south. In America, there's a substantial amount of population, not a majority, who are in the global south. I mean, the poor Hispanic African American families, they're very, sometimes they're in situations where their development indices are worse than that of Bangladesh or India.
Right.
So what happens is that, so the national argument is in a way it's the most practical argument because nations can make it. The global argument is inconvenient. So if you said that let there be a global tax on the global rich, then the global rich will use the national government to say, no, we have national sovereignty. I will pay tax to my government because that's the government I can control.
True.
Right? So there are all these. So the justice argument, there's clearly a justice case because the emissions are made by 1/5 of humanity, and about 12 nations. India and China are part of the 12 nations. They make the bulk of the emissions, and the emissions, the impacts fall hard on the poorer people.
Right.
So there's a clearly an injustice in human terms in the climate problem. Yeah, absolutely. There's also injustice about other injustices we can't address. So for instance, so if you so to give you an extreme example, which would be suicidal for us, hasn't happened yet. But if the seas are warming, if the average temperature, I was looking at this model, this is a model I'm talking about. The model was suggesting that if the seas warmed on an average by 6 degrees Celsius, then most of the planktons, these tiny little creatures, will die.
Yeah.
Now the planktons are a major source for oxygen in the air. So if the planktons die, we go, because you won't be able to breathe the air. The air needs fresh supply of oxygen all the time. So so in some ways, there's a intra-human question of justice, and there's a larger question of justice between humans and non-humans, because the users of the atmosphere are not humans alone. Trees use it, all other animal creatures use it, right? So, and the latter part of injustice is very hard to address. So politically, you can address injustice between humans, but they get politically hard because, as I said, I mean, see, if you look at the Indian rich who are actually able to consume, I don't think their consumption behavior is any different from consumption of a well-to-do person in the West. I mean, they aspire to Western lifestyles. And there's a Hoover Institution report which shows that while around 2000, 70% of the world's consumers were from nations you would think about, North America, Europe, Japan. Today, 70% are from India, China, Africa.
Right.
So human beings enjoy consuming because, see, electricity, energy, it's all about convenience in life. And as I say often to people that, people want to migrate from a society where the per capita consumption of energy is low to a society where per capita consumption of energy is higher. So sometimes in Australia, I knew a very lovely Bengali couple, PhD students. They've gone back to India. And I used to ask them jokingly, I said, so do you think you consume more energy here or back home? And they said, clearly here, because now they had 2 computers, they had 2 iPads, they had 2 smartphones. The number of things you have to keep charging grows when you move to a society with high energy consumption.
True.
And that society produces more personal conveniences. It all takes energy.
when you
Very
have,
true.
you yourself have been talking about the climate change and the details from within, and all kind of, micro narratives which emerge from the experience of, climate change discourse. In that kind of context, also the context which is coupled with the idea of manifold mediated micro blogged society, so to say, like so many micro narratives of society have emerged sharply, that the political dispensation is taking benefit out of it. In that kind of context, I wanted toward the end to invite you to ponder upon the possibility of a renewed journey of subaltern studies. I mean, don't you think that this was the time when we needed subaltern studies?
Dave, you've asked a question. It's the first time somebody has asked me that question. Because, people think of my current work on climate change as totally separate from subaltern studies.
Oh, it is not.
And sadly, many of my friends in subaltern studies think that. The first ever piece I wrote on climate change, when I had my first thoughts, was in Bangla. I wrote it for and my friend, someone in subaltern studies, read it and said, "Yeah, but these are not things we think about. Class struggle is more important, etc." Whatever. But from Gramsci hasn't thought about it, so why should we think about it? Kind of stuff. So there are many things to say. First of all, so something that people don't realize often is that the science of climate change is actually a science that goes beyond human experience. Why do I say it? I mean, climate itself is a scientifically constructed entity. A planetary climate doesn't exist. You don't bump into it. You have weather in your city. Right? Planetary climate is not something you see. So it's something that comes out of statistics, modeling, all kinds of things. But so sometimes people say, why don't we translate the science into what people will understand in local issues? Like in Delhi, if you say pollution, people will immediately know what you're talking about. They experience it. And when I hear that, I have to then remind them that the climate of the planet, according to climate science, is actually a result of many parts of the world doing certain things. And these are parts of the world where people have never lived. So one of the most important factors in setting the climate are the oceans. The planet is only 1/3 land. The existence, how will I translate into human experience what the oceans do? There's a North Atlantic conveyor belt, it's called, transference of water, which transfers heat. The role that the glaciers play, the role that the Amazon jungle plays. So sometimes, romantic people tell me, rural people always knew. I said, bhai, they knew certain things about nature, but they couldn't have known about climate science, because climate science is also about what these completely non-living, non-human things do, apart from the role that planktons and other things play. And we don't have that experience. So first of all, there is that. Secondly, in writing this book, and I think I say it in a footnote in the book, that on the whole, the Indian interests that I've encountered in climate change takes the form of two questions. One is often the justice question, that really they created it, they should pay. Is this an opportunity to punish the West, for all their sins? And the second thing becomes, what can we do, like the impact? But I have not heard in my last 10 years I've been working with many Indians asking, what is it? What is climate change? Whereas in the West, I found people have written books to explain this. Scientists have written. And my very sort of sketchy experience of China suggests that the Chinese have a same syndrome. So they ask, what can we do? They ask, what is the impact? How do we deal with the impact? But I don't know that the Chinese have written very fundamental books about what the phenomenon of planetary climate is, what climate change is. Because if they had, I'm pretty sure the book would have been translated. Whereas Germans have, the French have, the English have, the Americans have, the Australians have. And that tells me something. And it tells me that the West still has an institutional capacity to create a universal question. So sometimes I give this an example that what was the difference between 18th century West and 18th century India? Now, people used to travel. People used to travel from Iraq and from Middle East to India, from India to Middle East. And Sanjay Subramaniam and Muzaffar Alam's books on travel, I think it's called Travel in the Age of Discovery in this book. It will show that there are a lot of travelogues produced in Persian, in Arabic. Similarly, Europeans were producing travelogues. But the difference is that in Europe, there was a thing called the university. And in one such university, there was a man called Immanuel Kant, who out of these travelogues produced a class called anthropology. And in that class, one of his students was Herder. So they have a deep institutional capacity to convert empirical materials into a large question for human beings. And that's why I realized that the reason why sometimes I get the response in India from friends, Dipesh, this is all very interesting, but here we find that we have to make the issue local to be effective, which is a completely legitimate thing to say, but I was not working at that level. I was working to understand what is it, what is climate change, and what does it mean for the humanities? What does it mean for a historian's way of thinking?
That is fine, but even I, as a student who has passionately read Provincializing the Europe, would come to that question: how do we continue with the project of provincializing the Europe with this?
Exactly. So I'm now writing a book called Provincializing Europe in a Warming World. But it is part of Subaltern Studies project in a different way. So first of all, as I said, humans are a minority species. So we have to learn what in history we call minoritarian forms of thinking. So we have to learn to withdraw and live like a minority, think like minorities. So we have to go to learn from Gandhi in his South African days. We have to go to Jewish history to learn about being a pariah Jew. We have to go to read the lives of people like Picasso or Apollinaire. These are people coming from the margins of Europe into Paris. Becoming great artists, but completely rejecting the story of bourgeois Europe, never aspiring to bourgeois respectability. But these are people you have to go and say, okay, Kafka. Deleuze has written a whole book on Kafka being a minor, writing in a minoritarian way, this whole question of minority. And Provincial Europe has a discussion of this in the chapter on minority history, subaltern past, where I talk about the minor question. So there's that to be picked up and learned from. So the subaltern studies vista has to be expanded to consider the forced subalternization of other forms of life, the forced subordination of other forms of life to the human form of life. And what can we do about it while protecting human lives, while caring for other humans, while respecting questions of justice between humans, but also extending them to questions of justice between humans and non-humans.
Wonderful. That is the note on which we should give a pause to our conversation and look forward to the very next opportunity, which will be most probably when your book comes out. I'm looking forward to reading that book, and sure all of us will engage with you again.
All the best.